It was in 2013 in June, and that was the first day of my job when I started learning what is Angular. And I was super confused. I had to not only learn that, but also teach my seniors what Angular is because everyone was working on Flash back then. And trust me when I say this, it was super hard to learn Angular back then, even though there were a bit of documentation available, but there was not much content. But one of the things that really helped me was these videos called Angular in 60-ish minutes by Dan Wallin, John Papa, and the likes of other creators. And after learning from these experts, which were acknowledged by Google, a few years later, I myself became a Google developers expert in Angular. And today I'm giving you this video, which is on the same pattern, in which we are going to learn the modern Angular and a lot of core concepts in one single video. So without further ado, let's get started. This is Angular in 90-ish minutes, and you are going to learn a lot of cool things about Angular in this video. And I'm Mohammad Asanayas. I'm a software architect who has been coding with Angular for more than 11 years now. Yeah, I started with Angular 1.x and now I'm working still on the very latest version as well. So let's talk about what you should know so far before actually attempting this video. You should know basics of HTML, JavaScript or TypeScript. You should know CSS, a bit of it. You should know Git and basic programming concepts like for loops, variables, functions, and conditional, etc. And the tools you need for this particular tutorial are these ones. You need to have VS Code installed because I'm going to be using that. You need to have Node.js installed because we are going to run some things with Angular CLI. You should have Git installed, Angular CLI itself installed, and the Angular language server extension for VS Code. And the description of this video contains the link to these slides. So you can just come here and click these links and you should be able to download things very efficiently and fast. Now let's talk about what is Angular. Angular is one of the frameworks we have available today to implement or to work with web applications. And this allows you to create a single page web application where not multiple HTML files are served from your server. Now we're not going to go too much into single page applications versus multi-page applications, so stick with me for a while. Angular is also built by Google, and one of the fascinating things about Angular is that Angular is actually being used in Google. So a lot of Google applications, I believe including Google Analytics, uses Angular. So Angular team has to really support the development improvement of Angular because Google itself uses it. So they have, a lot of pressure from them as well, but then from the community as well. Angular has a huge community. There's so many people creating Angular apps each day, but then also creating a lot of libraries and tools that you can work with Angular. And I myself have created several libraries with Angular. So you will find a lot of good tutorials, a lot of help from the community, and it's amazing. Now, before we move forward, I also want to sneakingly just tell about the Angular Cookbook. As I mentioned, I have about 11 years of experience with Angular, and I've put all of that within the latest edition of the Angular Cookbook, which is up to date with Angular 18, and it contains a lot of practical projects that you can follow. More than 90 projects. The book says at 80, but it's more than 90 projects that you can work with, including a lot of cool things. So we're going to just go through quickly and then jump to the actual content. So the book will tell you about component communications, how to work with directives, and built-in control flow. We're going to cover these in this video as well. We also will talk about dependency injection, animations, RxJS, really important topic. We have NGRX, which is one of the coolest libraries to work with Angular for state management. We're going to talk about routing. We are also going to learn about forms, Angular CDK, unit tests, end-to-end tests, performance optimizations in Angular, and building progressive web apps with Angular. You can see I'm out of breath, but I did spend a lot of time writing this book, so I would highly encourage that you at least give it a look. And if you find the reviews helpful, which is about 4.2 stars rating on Amazon, get the book. But let's talk about benefits of Angular. Why shouldn't you just build something from scratch with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript? First of all, Angular and other frameworks allow you to have faster development, so you'll write less code and you get more output. Angular also has faster code generation. Because Angular has the Angular CLI, it allows you to just type some commands in your command prompt in your terminal, and then it generates a lot of code, which is super easy, and not a lot of other frameworks have the CLI for themselves. Angular is also unit test ready, so it doesn't matter what you're creating in Angular, whether it's a pipe, directive, service, or component, all of them have unit test files created with them, and you can just start coding in that. One of the things that I really like about Angular is that it is opinionated, which actually means that it is a community-wide established standard on how to code in Angular, which makes it super easy for developers to switch different teams and even different companies. It's very likely that if you have coded in Angular for one application, when you go to another company or another team, you'll find similar code, which is not the case for other frameworks out there which are not opinionated. And Angular provides a lot of code reusability. Since you can create components, services, pipes, you can basically reuse them multiple times in your project. And when you want to use it in another project, just copy the folder of the component service in the other one and you're good to go. Now let's talk about some pressing topics, Angular versus React and the myths about Angular. Let's address Angular versus React first. Angular is a framework. And when we talk about a framework is a set of practices and rules that a person has to follow while working on something, which means that it is composed of structures, opinions, and a lot of other things. Angular also has a built-in CLI, as I mentioned. So you use the Angular CLI to generate code, to build it, to serve the Angular application and whatnot. Angular also has a lot of tools and packages installed when you create a new Angular application, which is suitable for both small and medium scale application. For example, if you need to make HTTP calls from an Angular application, you don't need to install additional packages. If you want to use unit tests in your application, you don't need to install additional packages. And if you want to have something with forms, you don't need additional packages. So all of that is included when you create a new Angular application. And as I mentioned before, it is opinionated. Since it's a framework, you have better code style and consistency that can scale beyond teams and even companies sometimes. Now let's talk about React on the other side. And I'm not really bashing React here. It's a really good library to work with. I have been using React for about 6 years, but comparing with Angular, React is a tiny library. And yes, it is a tiny library. You just start with React and you can start building components. But as soon as you want a real app that does something, is usable for the users, you need more packages. For example, if you want to make HTTP calls, usually people go for Axios or something else. If you want state management, you go with Redux or something of that sort. If you are working with forms, you need a particular library. If you want form validation, you need a library. So there are a lot of things that you need with a React sort of ecosystem or React application, unless you go with, for example, Create React App, which has some of the things installed with it. Then you also have no CLI within React. If you need to create a component, you basically do it yourself. And it also requires you to install additional packages, as I mentioned, even for small to medium scale applications. Now, let's uncover some myths about Angular. The first one is Angular is hard to learn. That is not the case at all. Previously, when we had AngularJS, which was 1.x, and we migrated to Angular 2, that was the only difficult part in the whole Angular system where things became hard to learn. But Angular is really easy to learn, and you are going to see that in this particular video. So wait a while. Angular will change significantly on every update. That's also a myth. So every 6 months, Angular releases a new major version, which does not change so much significantly that you need to forget about all your previous practices time and again. It is constantly evolving. It adds more features, removes a lot of bugs and whatnot. But essentially, it's very convenient from migrating from one version to another. And they also provide this update sort of application in which you can select from which version of Angular you want to migrate to other one, and you have all the steps to just follow that, and it doesn't even take more than like a week for huge applications, so to say. Another myth is Angular is really slow. That's not really the case. According to a recent benchmark which actually took care of Angular version 18, Angular performed really well among the other ones. For example, if I just show you how Angular is doing with the recent changes which allows zoneless applications in Angular, you can see that it performs quite similar to Vue.js or Preact. This is a really cool benchmark for you to even look at. So since you have the link for this particular slides, just try it out and see the benchmark for yourself. Another myth is Angular has huge bundle size. This was the case in earlier versions of Angular like Angular 2, Angular 4, when the components needed to be compiled on the browser just in time. We called this just in time. And that was because Angular could not create instructions back then that were directly running in the browser. Well, that has changed now. So now when you create an Angular application, the whole Angular compiler is not built and thus the bundle size is not huge at all. And we are going to see that as well. So let's jump into the Angular core concepts. I'm going to highlight the things that are core concepts, but we are going to cover majority of them in this video. So first we have components, and then we have services, then we have directives, pipes, we have data binding, how to add event handlers like click, key up. Then we also have HTTP module, which is used to create HTTP calls. Then we have forms module, using which you work with forms, inputs, and other things as well. Then we have routing, that is how to create multiple pages in Angular application, which is a single page application. And then how to work with animations, which are direct native Angular animations. And then how to work with testing and building for production. Now we are going to start with creating an Angular application. The way we do that is using the Angular CLI. So to install the Angular CLI, you already should have Node.js installed. So go to the previous slides where I mentioned what tools we need. And once you have Node.js installed, you can run this command to install the latest version of Angular CLI. Once you have that, you can just run ng version and it should show you which version of Angular you're running. For now, I'm going to go to my terminal and just run ng version, and you're going to see which version I have. You can see that I'm running version 18.2.7. So I am on Angular 18 at the moment. Now let's talk about creating first application. To create an app, you say ng new and you give the name of your first application. And we can optionally run with dry run, which is an interesting flag. I'm going to show you. So if I go to my terminal and type this and say dry run, what this is going to do is this is going to run this whole process, but it will not create files on my hard disk. So this will not really create a project, but it will show everything throughout the process, and it will in the end not create anything. So first of all, it's asking me what is the CSS that I'm going to use. So I'm going to go with Sass with SCSS. Then I'm going to say no, I don't want SSR in this one. So I'll just press enter. And you can see that this will create a folder named first ng app, and inside that it will create a lot of files, Angular JSON, package JSON. Then we have a source folder. Inside we have the styles SCS. Then we have app component as well. Blah, blah, blah. But you see that the dry run option basically made sure that we don't have any changes made to the disk. So this folder was not actually created. Now I want to run actually this particular command, which allows us to have a component without additional files. So it makes it easier for us to learn in the beginning. So I'm going to copy this. And if I go here, I'm going to run this, and I'm running this without the dry run flag. And it seems like I have an issue here. So let's figure out it right here. So if I do ng new and I say help, this is going to show me what kind of parameters are allowed. So I want to see which one was the inline styles, so not inline styles apparently. So my slides are wrong. So here I can run this without the S in my inline styles. So here I'm going to just remove that. And now I can hit enter. Now it's going to ask me if I want to use SCSS. Yes, I will. And I'll say no to rendering. And now this will actually create the project for us. And it's also installing the packages for us. Pretty convenient. Now, one of the things I want you to see is in this particular case, it just created an app component TS file. You will see no HTML and no CSS because we opted for inline styles and template. And in the previous case, when we created it, it also created the HTML and CSS or the SCSS file. But we are going to open now this in VS Code. Cool. Now that my app is created, I'm just going to go ahead and say first ng app, and I'll open that in VS Code. All right. Now, when we look at our application, you're going to see that we have the package.json, a couple of things here, but I just want to go through the main file. So package.json is the main file for you to run any scripts. If you want to serve our development server of Angular application, we just need to run npm start from our terminal. When we want to build this for production, we are going to run npm run build. And when we want to run the unit test, we can run npm test. So if I open my terminal, I can go to view, terminal, and if I click this, I should be able to just open this. And if I run npm start, this is going to serve my application on localhost 4200. And now if I go to my app, you can immediately see we have welcome to first ng app being shown here. Now what I want to show you are the main files that everyone should know, and not a lot of Angular developers also look at these when they create an Angular application. The main entry point for any web application is the index.html or some main HTML. And in this particular HTML, this is where the top level component of the Angular app is rendered. So app root is the top level component that we are going to talk about. The second thing is main.ts. This file generates or creates the Angular application using the app component. So as I mentioned, the top level component is app component. And here we are telling Angular that, hey, you need to render the app component at the top. And I'm going to show you what that really means. Finally, the third thing is SCSS. So as you know, as a web developer, we have three things: HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. In Angular, we have HTML, SCSS, and TypeScript based on the project settings, of course. Now, when we look at the app component, this was also supposed to have multiple files like an HTML, an SCSS file, and TypeScript, but I opted to use the inline styles and inline template because I want to make things easier for learning for now, but you're going to see more files as we go forward as well. So if I go to the TypeScript file, here you will see a couple of things. We have a lot of things here mentioned, but we are going to go to that in just a bit. And the first thing that we are going to discuss is Angular components. What are Angular components and why should we care? Angular components basically comprise the whole application. So if you look at any Angular application or any web application, they're built on top of different building blocks. For example, you could have a button, you could have a header, you could have a date picker. All of those things that you see in the UI are actually components, and Angular components are no different. For example, in this app, we are going to look at the app component. We are going to create a header component and we are going to create a home component. And this is sort of the mock-up of how things should look like. In our application, the app component is already created when you create an Angular application. All we need to do is to create the header component and the home component. But before even going there, I want to show you the app component, how it is right now. Every component in Angular has a TypeScript file, and that has a class. So this class is what tells Angular that this is a component, but not just the class. Above the class, you will always find this component decorator. This decorator basically enhances the information about this class and tells Angular about a lot of things related to this component. For example, what is the selector of this component? That is app root. This is how, when Angular looks at the index.html, it knows that inside the body, this tag which is being used is actually this component. And then it goes ahead and renders welcome to title instead of the app component or inside it, so to say. What I mean is, if I go and inspect it here, you're going to see that in the elements tab, we do have the head, the body, and then inside that we have this app root. Now, when Angular looks at this app root, it identifies via this component decorator class that, hey, this app root means this component, which means I should actually render the template which is right here. And thus it goes inside and renders h1 and router. As you can see, if I change anything inside here, it is going to render it inside the app root component. Easy peasy. Now, one of the things that I would highly encourage you to do is to use the Angular DevTools extension. And this is how the extension looks like. You can just search Angular DevTools, and once you have that and install this, when you go to your elements tab or when you go to your Chrome inspector, which you can do by right clicking and click inspect, you will see an Angular tab right here. And when you click this, you can actually see the components as well. So here you see we have the app root component, and inside that we are also using a router outlet component, but we're going to talk about that later. In the app root, you see this property called app title, or just the title, which says first ng app. If I change this to essence app, for example, hit enter, you can see that this renders right here. So that's one thing about the component part, that is the selector, the app root. What else do we have in our component? We have standalone true. You can ignore this for now because it doesn't matter at the moment. This is also going to be removed going forward. What I want you to focus on is the template right here. The template here essentially is what gets rendered in the view. For example, I could go here and here I can press or type a p tag, for example, and here I could say something like hello world. And if I save this, go to my browser, I don't even have to reload my app. Angular dev server automatically reloads it. And now you see we also have this p tag right here in our elements, which means that whatever I render here or type here, it's going to be rendered in my application. Now, apart from this template, you also see this styles right here. But what you can do here is that you can add backticks here and you can actually write styles here. For example, here I could say something like p tag is gonna have a background color of red, for example. If I do this and save this, you can see that automatically my p tag now has the background color applied. One of the things that I really want to enforce here is, if you look at the styles here, you're going to see something interesting. You not only see the P, but you also see this bracket and something interesting going on here as well. And when you see the code, it's just P here. So what's really happening here? Angular makes sure that the styles you write within a component stays within the component. For example, if my global HTML after my app component had a p tag, and this was something like this is outside of app component. If I just do this, this p tag will not have the styles applied here, which is one of the most important things for a web developer to not leak styles. If I go to my app, you can see that this p is not affected. And the way Angular deals about this is that whenever you have a component and a style within the component, Angular first adds a particular attribute to that particular component, and then all the styles also have this attribute as well. For example, if I click P, you will find this exactly has the same attribute style. This is how it is essentially containing, or not exactly the same one, the ng content one. So this is how it's actually containing the styles within the component and not leaking outside. So I can quickly just say p tag or h1 tag, but I won't have to care about if the styles are going to be leaked out. Now we are going to continue with our logic of header and home component. What I want to do now is to create both of these components so I can render it just like this. So for this, you can just say ng generate component, like this whole term within the full form, or you can just say ng-gc and you can give the name of the component. When you do this, it creates it inside the source app folder. Let me show you. If I go to my terminal and open a new one, I'm going to let my server keep running, and then I'll open a new terminal. And in here, I want to run the command ng-gc and header. I want to run this with dry run so I can show you what happens when I run this. You can see that this generates the component inside the source app, and then it creates a folder for the header component and then creates the files inside those. Now I don't really want that. I want the header component to be inside a components folder. And the way you do that is that you can say ng component or ng generate component, and then you give the path components / header. So then it generates inside the source app components and then the header folder and then the header component. So this is what I'm going to do now. I'm going to copy this now. And then I'm going to run this with the dry run flag. And here you can see now it generates inside source app components, then header, and then the header files. One of the things that you'll notice is that now none of my files have the SCSS file and also the HTML file. I don't really want that. So I'm going to change something in my Angular JSON. In here, you can see that we have this projects, first ng template, and inside schematics, you can see in the Angular component, I have inline template true, inline style true. I'm going to actually remove these so we have separate files going forward. So I'm going to save this now and I'm going to run the command again. Now you can see that it generates the HTML file as well, and it also generates the SCSS file. Now I'm going to run this without the dry run. And there we go. Now we have our component created. If I scroll up, look at here, we have the components folder, and inside we have the HTML and CSS files containing those things. And in the TypeScript file, now you're going to see something different. Here we have the selector called app header, but now instead of the template, unlike here we had template, now here we have template URL, and it points to where is the HTML file for this header component compared to the TypeScript file. And it's right here. So this is pointing to the right file. Similarly, it's pointing for the SCSS file. And now that we have the header component, let's also generate the component for home as well. Since home is going to be a page, I'm not gonna actually create a component in the components folder. I'm going to create this outside. So let's do it like this. I'm going to just say ng-gc and home so I can create it outside of the components folder. And now we have a home component right here as well. Now what I want to do is to be able to render both the header and the component and the home component right here inside my app component. So ideally my app root should show app header and app home. For this, I'm going to do two things. One, in my app component where I have to render both of them, I have to first import these components. So here I'm going to go and add home component just like this. And I'm going to hit enter and it's automatically going to import this. And then I'm also going to say header component just like this. Now that I've imported those, I can remove all of these from here. And then I can say something like app, and you can see Angular language server, that is the extension for VS Code, is already helping me. So I can say app header just like this, and I can say app home just like this. Now let's save this. And if I go here, you can see it says header works, home works. And as I said, now the app root has the app header and then the app home. Easy peasy. I'm going to also go and remove this paragraph from the index.html. We don't really need that. And this looks super nice now. Now what I want to do is to style this a bit better. So first I'm going to go to my style CSS and add some styles. I'm going to say that we have the HTML, we have the body right here, and then we are going to simply say margin 0, padding 0. We are also going to say asterisk outline none. And now we can quickly go ahead and style the header and the home. So first I'm going to go inside the header component, and here we have a header works. So here we are going to first create a nav, or instead of the nav itself, we are also going to create a header component as well. Now we're going to put the nav inside this. So let's do that. And inside the nav, we are going to say my first Angular app. So here now you can see my first Angular app. Now we are going to style this a bit. So we are going to quickly go to SCSS, and here we are going to say this header is going to be a display flex. We're going to have padding inline set to 16 pixels. We are also going to have padding block set to 8 pixels. We are also going to have the background color set to 333. And the color is going to be white. We're also going to have items center or align items center, and justify content set to between, space between. Now, one of the things that I did wrong was the header here. So this should not be a class, but rather an element. So let's save this. And now you can see that we have a really nice header that shows right here. Now we're going to make sure that the padding that we have in the header is same as what we have here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually go to my app component here, and instead of the app home, I'm going to put that inside the main tag, something like this, and I'm going to put the app home right here. And what I'm going to do is to style the main tag here. So I'm going to quickly go here and say, instead of this, I can say main, and instead of this style, I'm going to say simply padding inline, and this is going to be 16 pixels, and padding, or actually I want the padding to all of the sides be 16 pixels. Now when we go here, you can see that the home is aligned with the header. Super cool. And now that we have this essentially working, I want to go forward. Now we are going to talk about Angular data binding. What is Angular data binding? Why is it a really important topic? Angular data binding is the way you bind the data from your TypeScript class of Angular to the template, which is the HTML. How do you make them communicate with each other, and how do you render data dynamically if the data changes? So we're going to look at some examples. One, with the modern Angular signals, and second, which is not so modern, but you can say, for example, Angular 16 and below, but it still works till today. So with the signals, which is a new thing in Angular, what you do is you can, in your TypeScript class, create a signal. You can create a signal of type string, a number, an object, doesn't really matter. It has to be a signal. And once you have the signal, you essentially can render this in your template using these curly braces. So you need to have in your template these curly braces, and inside you can use any of the variables from your TypeScript class. So let's try these now. So I'm going to go to my header, and inside my header, you're already seeing that in the HTML, we say my first Angular app. What if we did not hard code this in the HTML and had it inside our TypeScript? So here we can say we can create a title property, and we are going to make it a signal. So as soon as you type signal, you can click it. You can see it imports from the signal right here from Angular core. And here I can say my first Angular app. And once I have this title here, now I can go to my HTML, and here I can get rid of all of this, and I can use the double curly brackets, and now I can say title. Since title is a signal, Angular's language service will already tell you that this is a function and it should be called just like this. This is a recent improvement and I love it. So I need to call it just like this. And this is exactly how you retrieve a value from a signal. Now, if I go to my application, you can see it says my first Angular app. Now, this is not coming directly from the HTML. It's coming from our TypeScript class using the signal and being rendered here. If I go to my Angular extension here and click app root, and inside app header, you can see that the title here is essentially a signal that has a value my first Angular app. And I can change this to, for example, SN, and I hit enter, and you can see that this changes here as well. So this is actually coming from the property within our app header component. This is not hard coded. Now, the other way we create data binding within our Angular application is using without signals. And the only change in that is that you don't really use a signal property, and you don't really call the function invocation here. If you compare this with this one, here we needed to use the small brackets, but here we don't really need to use the small brackets at all. So if I wanted to change that, and if I wanted to remove the signal from here, then my HTML template will be really angry with me, and I need to remove this as well. And if I save this now and go to my application, you can see it still works. You can still see that the header has a property called title. Now, this is not a signal, as you can see, but if I change this to anything as well, you can see that the changes reflect here. Now, the question would be, what should you use? Should you use signals or should you use non-signals? I would highly encourage that you start using signals from today, because this is going to be the de facto way of using data binding in the future. So don't use the traditional way unless you really have to, or if you're working with Angular 16 or below, so to say, where signals are not really mature. So I would highly encourage to use signals whenever possible. Now the next thing we want to do is to implement more components inside the home component. So we are going to have a counter component, and we are also going to have a greeter component. We are going to start with greeter because I want to show you another thing about data binding. So we're going to create the greeting component just like this. So I'm going to copy this. I'm going to go to my code, go to my terminal, and here we are going to just run nggc components/greeting. This is going to create another folder inside the components. And now you can see components has the greeting folder as well. And now I can use that. Now what I want to show you is something called passing the data. So first, we are just going to render this greeting component inside home. Since greeting has to be used inside home, I need to go to the home component, and I want to go to the imports inside it, and I want to use the greeting component right here. So I want to import this. Now that I have this, I can go inside the template, and instead of just the homeworks, I can go here and say, or even below this for now, I'm going to remove homeworks later on. But here I'm now going to say app greeting, and here you can see we have this. Now if I go to my components here, you can see we have app root, below we have app header component, and then we have the home, and inside the home we have the greeting right here that is highlighted. This is what we wanted. And this is partially what we have done so far. So we have the app component having home, inside we have the greeter component. Now what I want the greeter component to do is to greet me with a message that I pass from the app. The header component is a bit different. The header component has its property in the header components TypeScript file, and the template of the header component uses that property. So both of the things are related to header component. But the greeting component is a bit different. The greeting component will not have the message in the greeting component class. This will be passed from its parent, and its parent is essentially home component. So home component has to have a message that it can pass to greeting. So here if I say message equals, and I say signal, and I can say, for example, hello world. Now, how do I pass this message to greeting? If you look at the HTML, the home component uses app greeting. So it is possible for me to pass the information via the template. But even before that, if I want to pass something to greeting, the greeting is supposed to be able to accept it. It's like I should not go to someone's house if they have not really allowed me to do so. So ideally, in this particular case, the greeting component should say, hey, I can accept an input that you can pass, and then home component can pass that input. So how we do this here is we say something like message equals input, and this input comes from Angular core. And what this basically does is that it tells Angular that this component can receive something from the outside. And since we always want this message, we should use required in this case. But I'm going to tell you why I'm not doing that for now. I will here say default greeting message. For example, instead of this, we can say hello. And now that I have this message here, I want to render that inside here. So instead of greeting works, I would say something like h2 greetings. And here I'm going to have a p tag. And here I'm going to actually render the message. Since the message itself is a signal, even though if it's an input signal, I want to use the variable here, which is message, but with the parenthesis. So now I can access the value. Now if I save this, go to my application, and you can see greetings, hello. The hello here basically shows the message right from the component. If I go to the Angular DevTools, go to app greeting, you can see that the message has the value hello right here. Now I don't want this hard-coded value or the default value to show. I want to pass something from the parent. How you can do this is from the home component. Now you can go and pass this with square brackets. So here I can say something like square brackets, and you can already see that we see this message, and this comes from greeting component.message, right? So if I click this, I can now say a message in the single quotation, and I can say hello world. So I can hard code something like this, or hello world 1 2 3 4. And now save this, and now you can see that this value becomes hello world 1 2 3 4. If I click app greeting, you can see that this is a read only signal. It says hello world 1 2 3 4, which is coming from the app. If I click app home, you can see that this one is a bit different. So instead of this hard-coded value, how about I send the value that I have in here, which is hello world. So we have the home components message, or we can rename this to something like home message.
which is a signal. So instead of passing a hard-coded value, now I can say this is gonna be home message, just like this. If I save this now, you can see that this becomes hello world, and this is actually coming from home. So if I say hello world right here, which is this one, this directly goes to the greeting one and says hello world. What happens if I change this? If I say hello world, good day, you can see that it changes inside the app greeting as well. I did not change it inside app greeting. I changed it outside in the home component. And since whatever is in home is passed to the greeting message, it automatically goes there and gets updated. That is the beauty of data binding. So a parent can pass a value in the child component just like this. Now, this is one way of passing information when you actually have a variable. If I wanted to just pass something hard coded, I could just say something like hello, what's up, for example, and this is also valid. If I see here, you can see it says hello WhatsApp because it's passing this directly as a string. As soon as you start providing this is square brackets, now this expects here to be JavaScript, which means it has to be a JavaScript statement. You can't really write it like this. If you want a string to be passed, you either pass this in the single quotations or you use a variable as we did before. We did home message, something like this. And there we go. Cool. Now we have this data binding concept clear from parent to child. Let's move forward. We're going to talk about something called event listeners in Angular and how they work. You can bind event listeners directly in the template using this syntax, which is you use the small bracket and then you can use the default browser events like key up, key down, key press, click, double click, and whatnot. When you apply this directly to a particular HTML element, you can pass a handler from your TypeScript file and it calls it. Let's try this out. So I'm going to copy this input and I'm going to actually go and create something inside the home component. So just after greeting, I'm just going to pass this. Now I'm going to copy the key up handler from here and then I'm going to go to the TypeScript file to create this function. Just like this. Now let's save this. Let's save the HTML. And now if I go to my application and start typing something, I'm also going to open console here. Now if I type, for example, SN, you can see that we get this log user type something, user type something, user type something 5 times. The number of times I've pressed it right here. Now, if I press backspace, you see more logs. And even if I press shift, you can see that here you see all the logs. So it doesn't matter what key I'm pressing, directly it shows you the logs. This is one way of doing things. In this particular way, we are saying that whenever there's a key up, just call my function. I don't really care what key was pressed. But what if I really wanted to see which key was pressed? In that particular case, you can use the event and pass it to your TypeScript function. So you do it something like this. Your function should be able to accept a parameter like this. And then from your template, you pass this $event. $event is the actual browser event that is passed to the Angular function that you have in your TypeScript. So I'm going to do that now. So first I'm going to go to my home component TS and here I'm going to say there's going to be event here and this is going to be of type keyboard event. And then I'm also going to say in the template, now I'm going to pass the event. And that's pretty much it. I would also change the message log as well. So I'm going to copy this from my slides just like this. And then I can go to TypeScript and then I can type it just like this. So take some time to just notice what's happening here. Whenever the key up is pressed or there's a key press, it's going to take the event and will log the user press this particular key. So if I go to my app now, refresh, and if I just say A, you can see user press the A key and then SN, you can see the whole keys here. If I press shift, you can see the shift here, control is here as well, enter is here as well. So all the keys that I'm going to press are going to be shown right here because we are able to pass the values. If I click this button, I can also put a breakpoint here and here is some debugging for you or early debugging, so to say. So if I press a key, for example, shift, you can see that this comes here. Here is the call stack. So this is where we are right now. And one step above is the template. So we came here from this template. When we did a key press, it essentially looked at, okay, which function should I call? And this is the event. If you mouse over, you can see this is the keyboard event that has all the information, including the key, which should be right here. So the key was shift. And then it came here in our handler with the same event. And now we took out the key and we basically logged what we wanted to log. I'm going to remove the breakpoint and let's move forward. And now that we know about how to bind event listeners, we can actually create something useful. We're going to create a counter application or a counter component that we are going to render within the home component. So we're going to just copy this and we're going to go to our console, clear this guy, and then run this. Now this is going to create the counter component within the components folder. So here is our counter component. I'm going to close all the files from here. And now since I want to render counter component, which should say counter works in my home component, I'm going to go to my home again, and I'm going to import the counter component as well. Notice that we have so far the greetings component, but now I also have counter component. If I go to the template of home, here you can see we are rendering homeworks. I can remove this now, I think. Now we have app greeting and the input. So right after the app greeting, I'm gonna say app counter, and we can render it just like this. If I save this, go to my app, you can see we have greetings here, then we have counter works, and then we have the input right here. Now the input could also have something like a placeholder, which can say type something just to make this a bit nicer. And here this looks cool. Now instead of the counter works, I want to create a really simple, effective counter application, which should show the value of the counter and should also be able to increment, decrement, and reset the counter. I'm going to do this pretty fast, but you can go and slow the video and then follow along as well. So now that we have the counter component, I'm going to go and close these. I'm going to go to the counter component and we are going to create a couple of things. So first we are going to create a p tag in which we are going to say counter value colon, and here we are going to have a value. Then we'll have three different buttons. So I'm going to say div. Here we have a button that says increment. We're also going to have a button that says decrement, and then we are also going to have a button that says reset. Now these three buttons will have three different functionalities: increment, decrement, and reset. So we're going to go to our component and we are going to create these functions. So we can say increment, decrement, and reset. So these three functions are here. Now instead of having the hard-coded value 0 here, we are going to create a signal for this. So here we can say counter value, and this is going to be a signal, and the initial value is going to be 0 right here. Now we are going to say in increment, we are just going to say this dot counter value dot set. Now this is really important. We want to use the signal and update the signal. We can't really do counter value equals in this particular case because that would not make sense and would not update the value. So we can't really do 1 because this will say it was a signal. Now you're trying to assign a number to it. That doesn't work. So we need to say set, and then we can say something like this dot counter value plus 1. So getting the current value will be using the parenthesis, and then we can add one value to it. Instead of doing this, we can actually use the update method, which automatically gets the value just like this. So here you can say something like value, and here you can say val plus 1. So what we are doing right here is that we are saying, hey, use the update function, get the latest value, and then add 1 to it and combine them and return. So this will update the value and increment it by 1. We can do the same thing here for the decrement as well. So if I do this, but instead of plus here, we are going to say minus. And in the reset, I just want to say this dot counter value dot set, and here we just need to set it to 0. Now that we have all of this here, we can go to our component. Instead of the hard-coded value, we can say something like this counter value, and using the parenthesis for it. And then for these ones, we are going to implement the click handlers. So here we can say click, here we can say increment, and I'm going to do the rest of them as well. And now when you look at the application, you can see the counter value here is 0. If I say increment, the value increases. If I say decrement, the value decreases. And if when I say reset, the value sets to 0. I'm just going to show you quickly by debugging this. So if I press Ctrl P, I say counter.component.ts, and I can go inside increment to show you what happens when I click this. So I'm also going to put the breakpoint right here as well, so you can see the values. So if I hit increment, you can see it comes here and tries to call the update method. Then it goes inside and brings the value. The value right here is 0. Now it's going to increment this to 1. And once it does that, it automatically can return the latest value. And now we have 1 right here. You can go to the Angular sort of Chrome extension as well. And if you look at the counter right here, you can see that the counter value here is 1. And if I set to decrement, you can also see the values right here are set back as well. Super cool. If I said reset, you can see here we have the value set to 0. All right, this is super cool. I will just add something to make these a bit distinguishable because it seems too close. So we're quickly gonna go to our home component, and in here where we have this input, I'm just going to add some style. So here I will say input, and these are not production level styles. So just ignore if you really don't like global styles, but I'm just going to say margin top 10 pixels. Let's save this. So we have something at least here. Now what we want to do is to go forward and talk about routing in Angular. How can you create multiple pages or multiple routes? So far what we have is just a header, just some app or a home component that has some things. But what if I wanted, let's say, a to-dos page where I have a list of to-dos? In that particular case, understanding routing is really important. So since Angular is a single page application, it allows via routing to have multiple pages so that user can navigate to different pages. It also allows the browser to only load the JavaScript for the page that the user is watching or will go to later on. For example, if you go to the home page, by default, it will only load the bundle related to home page. If you go first to the to-dos page, it will only load the to-dos page. And then if you go to home, then it will load the home page bundle as well. And we're going to see that in just a bit. But this makes it really, really fast for the browser to load only the things that are necessary for the current page and delay everything for later. For this, we need to understand what's happening here. We're going to have the app component. We are going to have the header as before, but the home is now going to be handled by something called a router outlet. We're going to use router outlet here. And then we are going to create a new to-dos route as well. For this, we are going to use nggc to-dos and create a new component for it. So first, let's go to our terminal, and then we are going to create the to-dos component. Now, you will notice that I'm not creating the to-dos component inside the components folder. I'm moving this outside just like home. So all the pages that you have in an Angular application, you can keep them at the top if you have a very simple application, of course. So let's just create that. Now we have the to-dos page here as well. Now we are going to handle the routing. How do we create different routes? As I mentioned, we do need to use the router outlet, but I want to show you what happens if I don't. So you can go to your app.routes.ts, and here is where we define all the routes. By default, we don't have any routes. So we're going to define the first route here. We're going to use path here, and we are going to say that if the path is empty, which means we are at the top or root, then we use component, a component that we are going to tell. But I also want to use path match full, which is required if you're using just empty route. So if the path match full is here and we have the empty route, then I want to load component, and this load component essentially takes a function. In this function, you're supposed to return something, and that is an import statement. Here you can say that from this place I want to go to home, and inside the home component file I have something that I want to return, and that is you use then. And in here you can say module and then module dot home component. How do I remember all of this? I think I've built more than 100 Angular applications. So here we have the home component ready to be rendered, right? Now the interesting part here is that if I do this, I don't even need to go to my home component or app component and use home here. I can just remove this. I can just remove this, sorry, not the header one, just the home one, and then remove it from here as well. So now we have the header and then the main. However, now we don't have the home component at all. And that is because our app root and our app header are the only things that are inside the application. But if you remember correctly, I said we are going to render the home and to-dos using a router outlet. This is what we are missing. So we're going to go here, and you can see we already had the router outlet before. We removed it before, but now I'm going to put this back inside here. So I can say router outlet just like this and save this. Now when I go back to my application, you can see automatically that we have the home component being rendered on the default route, which is localhost 4200 and nothing else. You can see that we have the app root, app header, and the router outlet is what is rendering the app home. If you go to elements, you can also see that right here we have the app root, inside we have the header, and just besides the router outlet we have the app home component. Now what we can do about the to-dos one? So we can go to our app routes here, and we are going to generate another one. Here we are going to say to-dos, and here we are going to use the same thing, the load component structure. So here we can say load component, and here I'm just gonna write the function again. So return import, and here we can say to-dos component dot then, and here we can say return m dot to-dos component, just like this. Now if I go to my application, refresh, and try to go to /to-dos, you're going to see that it goes to to-dos works. Super cool, right? But you might have noticed one thing. When I did that, the whole page had to reload. If I remove this, hit enter, you can see that we get this cross and this whole application loads. We don't really want that. This is a single page application. We should be able to navigate back and forth. So instead of just trying to go from here, we can also try to have a link here to to-dos. For this, we are going to go to our header component and import something called router link. So here I can go into imports, I can say router link, which comes from Angular router. And now in my HTML, I'm gonna put in nav, we have just the title here. So we're gonna do two things here. We're gonna go and have a span here, inside which we have the title. And then we should also have sort of a UL and li here. And in the li, we can have the router link. So here I will say something like to-dos. And here I can say something like router link. And here I can say backslash to-dos. So this is gonna take me to to-dos, and this guy is gonna actually take me to home. So here I can say router link and just backslash here. Now if I save this, go to my app, you can see here we have to-dos. Here we have my first Angular app. If I click this, I go to home. If I click to-dos, I go to to-dos. And you will notice that the page does not refresh. This is what we actually wanted. So in a single page application, without reloading the whole HTML and the browser, just the content inside the app root changes. So if I open this main, you will see that if I go to to-dos, just this thing changes. So if I click this, you can see app home. If I click this, you can see app to-dos. This is the beauty of router outlet and Angular's routing. Now I want to make this a bit nicer. So what I'm going to do is add some styles. So here I can go and say inside the header, we had the nav. We're going to make this flex or display flex. And then we are going to say justify content space between. And inside here, we are also going to say items center. Finally, we'll also address the UL and li. So here we are going to say list style type or list style none actually. If I save this now, go to my app, you can see this becomes much nicer, but I also wanted this to take the full width. If I go to nav, I think the nav is not taking the full width. So the header has the full width, but if I look at the nav, yeah, it's pretty small. Even the header doesn't take the full width. So let's correct that. So I'm going to go to header here and I'm going to say the width is going to be 100% and the nav is also going to have the width of 100%. Save this. Now that doesn't really look good. So we need to remove this from the header. So I'm going to remove this. Now this looks nicer. One more thing that we may want to do is when we have the list items being hovered, for example, li, we can change their color. So here we can say and hover and we can change the color to something like EEE. Save this. And now when I go here, they change a bit, but it's not really apparent. Maybe change this to something lighter. So maybe 777. And I also want this li to have a cursor of pointer. So people can actually know that this is a link. So here you can see the cursor changing and the link also changing. I'm going to do the same for the span as well. So I can actually copy this and inside the nav, I'm going to paste this and let's just change this to span. And I'm going to say immediate span, not every span. Now, if I do this, you can see the home and here we have to-dos. Great. Now we're going to go one step forward. In the to-dos, we are going to have a component for to-do items as well. So let's create that. So I'm going to go to my terminal and here I will say nggc and components slash to do dash item. Since this is a component, I've put that in the components folder instead of the page level. So I hope you understand that by now. And now we are going to jump to something called Angular services. Angular services are essentially something that is used for having data within them, having some sort of processing within them, and also to make HTTP calls. Anything that is not directly related to rendering or showing something in the UI, I personally move that into a service. And that's also an opinion for majority of the Angular community as well. So we are going to start by working with the to-dos Angular service. So I'm going to create this by just running this command. So I'm going to go to my terminal, clear this, run this, and this will create a service inside the services folder. Now, when I run this, you're going to notice something interesting. For each component, when I run the same thing, it creates a folder of the component itself. When we run this for services, the services does not create a folder for to-dos. It directly creates the service file inside that, which is fine. So if I open the services, you can see that we have the to-do service right here. And if I open it, you'll see that it is quite similar to the component that we have. The only difference is that unlike the component decorator that we have here, for services, we have something called injectable, which means that the services can be injected in other places. Now, one of the things I want you to remember is that a service can either be provided directly in a single component. For example, you could say that this is just going to be here in this header component, which means I'm going to go here and say providers, and I can say something like to-dos service. Now, this means that this service can only be used inside the header component and nowhere else. If you want that, then you need to remove this whole thing, the provided in root, from here completely. If you don't want that, then you can put this back. And this means that now, just by putting this provided in root, I don't really have to provide this into each single component. And this will be available everywhere regardless. I'm also gonna just remove this signal from here as well. Now that we have the service, let's talk about how we can use this. The first thing I want to do is to have some to-dos that I can render on the UI or just console log maybe. So I want to have the component having the data from the service. Now, when we go to our to-dos page, you see it says to-do works. What if I had an array of to-dos and I could use that within the component .ts. Now for the to-dos, I'm going to create a type. So here I'm going to go and say something like a model folder. And inside that, I could say something like to-do.type.ts, for example. And here I can create a type. So I can say export type to-do item, for example, or just to do. And here I'm going to tell what is going to be the type or what data it will contain. So we'll have a user ID, which will be of number. We'll also have completed, which is going to be a Boolean. We're going to have title, which is going to be a string. And then finally, we'll also have an ID, which is going to be a number. And we're going to use an API later on for this as well. But let's assume I wanted some to-dos. I can actually create them right here in the to-do service. So here I could say to-do items equals, and I can create an array here. But I will define what kind of array it is. So I can say array, and here I can say to-do item or just to do. So this to do is coming from the model file. And now here I can say my first to do is having the title, and you can see IntelliSense automatically helps me because of this typing. So here we can say, for example, title is going to be groceries. Then I should have ID 0, user ID, let's say 1, and then completed is going to be false. So unless I give all of the types is gonna not like me at all. So let's paste this. Now the other one can be something like car wash, for example. The ID of this is supposed to be 1 and the user ID remains the same, completed is false. Now that I have to do items, how do I use this service into any of the components? Since this is an injectable, I can inject this in other places. So I'm gonna go to my to-dos component, which is right here. And inside this, I'm gonna go to the component file. And in here, I have to, in my TypeScript class, inject the service. So here I could say to-do service equals, and now I can use the inject function right here. So I can say inject, and here I need to say to-do service. So simply it says in my component, inject the to-do service and assign this to this variable. Now I can use in my entire code this to-do service anywhere at all. So in here, now inside of the to-dos component HTML, I can actually render the to-dos right away. Now what I want to say for now is I want to just go ahead and say something like implements on init, which is a lifecycle loop, and we are not really talking about that in this particular video. But what this basically does is that this allows me to have a function which runs when the component is initiated. So here I'm just gonna run this or console.log this dot to do service dot to do items, just gonna render them or just gonna console log them. If I save this now, go to my app, go to console, here you can see an array of 2 items. Yay! So you can see in my component, I am able to access the value from the service. We can also put breakpoints here. So if I refresh now, you can see that this says to do service, which has the to do items. Of those 2, this is what we have right now. Super cool. Now this ng on init will trigger whenever this component is initiated or rendered, so to say, or not re-rendered, but the first time it comes into view. If I go to home, if I go back to to-dos, it's gonna run again because now the to-do page is coming up. So this runs ng on init, and you can see that still we have not rendered it. But if I just go ahead and hit play, now you can see to-dos work, right? If I go back, come back again, this ng on init is gonna run because when you go from the page, the component is destroyed. When you come back, the component is reinitiated. Now that we have this, we should probably render those things into the UI. There are 2 steps to that. One, we need to take out things from this to-do service into a signal. Now we could directly use this service in the HTML right away. For example, I could go here, just remove this and say to-do service, which is available, dot to-do items, and I would be able to render them. If I save this, you can see that this says object, 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 object. Not really nice, right? But I could do something like the first item dot title. And if I do this, now I should have the title for the first item. Super cool, right? But I want to change this to use signals. So I'm going to go here and say something like to do items equals signal. Now I can tell what kind of signal this is. This is going to be a signal of array of to do. And I'm going to import this from model to do. Now I'm going to use parentheses and initiate this with an empty array. So this is empty in the beginning, but after ng on init, when I have this, I can actually set the value of the signal. So here I can say this dot to do items dot set, and here I can say this dot to do service dot to do items. So I'm taking the information from the service and I'm setting them as signal right here. Super nice. Now that I have this signal of to do items, I can render this instead of the to do service thingy. So I can go here and say to do items, parenthesis is important because you're trying to access a signal, and this evaluates to an array, so I can just use it like this. If I go back to my app, you can see this is being rendered from the signal. Super cool. But what if I wanted to render every single item? And this is something we have not discussed so far. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use something from the Angular built-in control flow, which means that I can say @for, and here I can loop over the array. So here I will say to do of, and here I can say to do items like this. And I need to use the parentheses, as you know. And then inside this, I can now render this right here. But instead of saying to do item 000 blah, 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 I can now just say to do. So see what we are doing here. We are saying run a loop on to do items array by accessing this. For each to do, which is of type to do, render its title. Easy peasy. If I save this now, I'm going to go and render both of them. So if I go to elements and if I try to inspect this, you can see that in the app to dos, we have now 2 p tags. In our template, we have just 1, but it doesn't really matter. If I add more to do items there in my service, it is going to render all of them. That's the beauty of it. One thing I want to tell you is when we use the for loop, we also track, and we track on the basis of what is unique among all these items. If you remember in our service, the uniqueness is the ID. Every to-do item has to have a unique ID. So what I could do in the to-dos template is instead of tracking index, which can be a valid approach in a lot of cases, but not every one of them. Here I can say to-do.id. And this is what is going to be tracked. This really improves the performance when you're using the for loop. Now, if I render this, you can see everything works as expected. Super nice. Now we're going to take one step more. Instead of rendering a hard-coded array from a service, we want the service to talk to an external API, which is jasonplaceholder.typicode.com. You can find this in the description of this video as well. But ideally what this does is that it provides us an API to us, which we can run and get a lot of to-dos. For example, if I just copy this guy from here, go right here and hit enter, you can see that we get an array of a lot of to-dos with the same signature, user ID, title completed. So what I want to do now is to use this API. So for this, we need a couple of things. We need to provide the HTTP module or the providers in the app. We do that by going to the app config using provide HTTP client. Then we inject the HTTP client service into our Angular service, and then we use the HTTP methods. So let's try this out right now. So we're going to go to our to-do service. I'm going to close the other ones. And here we need to inject the HTTP client. But even before that, we need to go to the app config. And in here, you'll see that we have the providers array. We're going to add one more thing here. You can see here we have provide router, which provides the routing configuration. We have zone detection. We don't really want to talk about that at the moment. But here, just before this provide zone change detection, we are going to say provide HTTP client, just like this. And then we use this like this. Now that we have the HTTP client right here, we can use the HTTP client service. So now we can go here in our service and say HTTP equals inject, and here we can say HTTP client. And just by doing this, now we have access to HTTP get, HTTP post, HTTP patch, all of those things. So what I want to do here is that I want to, instead of this constructor, I want to create a function, something like get to dos or get to dos from API, something like this. And this is supposed to return this dot HTTP. Since the HTTP is sort of a property of the class, I can do this dot HTTP dot get, and this get requires a URL. So I can construct the URL right here. So I can say something like const URL equals, and here I can use the URL from the browser. So I can go here, copy this whole URL, come back to the code and paste this. You can see this is https jsonplaceholder.typico.com/todos. And now that we have this, we can use the URL right here. Now, when you look at the function signature, it says we are going to return an observable of type object. I want to specify what kind of data we are returning. So just after this get, what you can do here is you can say you're gonna have an array of to do, and that's pretty much it. Now when you look at the function, it says we are going to return an array of to dos. Beautiful. Now what I'm gonna do is, now that we have this function, we can make this whole thing empty, and we actually don't even need this array anymore because the array is going to come from the server or from the API. So I'm gonna save this. My component is gonna be super angry with me because we don't have anything now. So here you can see that this is crying. So instead of this, what we should do now is we should have to get the data from the API, and then we should be able to set it. Now, this is not going to work just like this. So what I have to do now in the ng on init is this dot to do service dot get to dos from API. I'm going to call this, and this returns an observable. When we are working with promises, the syntax is different. And here we can then do subscribe. On even before that, we can also do a pipe that can use an error, for example. So here we can say something like, or I think it's called catch error. Yeah. And in here, we essentially have an error that we can work with. So here we can say error. We can also console.log the error. And then we can also do throw the error just like this. And in the subscribe, we can go ahead and say, here we're going to get the to-dos from the API. And here I'm going to paste my code again. And instead of this .todo service.todo items, I just need to say to-dos. Now you will see that this to-dos is essentially what comes back from this function, get to-dos from API. And then we should be able to set it. Now, if anything goes wrong, if the API URL is wrong, if the server is down, we will basically be seeing this right here. Now you can alert the user, you can show a toast, be creative, but I've just put something bare minimum for now. Now, if I go to my app, let's see what happens. Hey, look at that. All of these to-dos are actually coming from the API. And you can see them right here as well. So how does this really work? If I go to sources, I can show you the whole process via debugging. So this is going to be my first breakpoint. I'm going to go inside catch error and the subscribe one. Now, if I refresh now, you will see that we are going to come into ng on init. Now this is going to go to to-do service and inside the get to-dos from API. So this goes inside, creates a URL just like this, and then it makes the API call. Once it makes the API call, this returns the data in the subscribe in terms of to-dos. This is an array of about 200 items, and then it just sets it just like this. Super cool. Now that we have the to-dos, we set them to our to-do items signal. And since our template or HTML uses this signal, it automatically renders all of them. Super nice, right? So I'm going to quickly go to my UI and I'm going to update this a bit to make it look nicer. So we're going to have a heading here. We're going to say to-dos list. Then we're going to have a UL right here. And then we're going to have the for loop just like this. And we're going to change this p tag to actually be a list item. In the list item, we're going to have two things. We're going to have h4, which is actually going to show the title. And we're also going to have an input, which is going to be the checkbox to mark this complete or not. Here we can say the type is going to be checkbox, and the value is actually going to be if it's checked or not. So here we can simply say something like to do dot completed. Now you can see this looks like this, but I want them to be in a single line. So we're going to style this a bit. We're going to give this some classes. So we are going to call them to-dos. And then here we are going to call them to-dos __ item. And this is using the BEM terminology, but you don't have to look into that at the moment. I'm just going to write the styles as well. So to-dos, and here we can say item. And inside here, we're going to say this is going to be display flex. We are going to have items, align items center. And we are also going to have a gap of 8 pixels. If we look at the to-do items now, they look pretty nice, and I need to be able to click here, but now I want to wrap everything inside a label. So what I want to do is inside here, I'm going to change this h4 to actually be a label, and I want to also make this for the input. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to provide this some ID, and here I'm say something like to do _, and then I'm going to use to do .id, and actually this should be to do dash instead. And here I can say for, and I can do the same thing. So to do dash dash or dash. And then here I can say something like to do.id. which means that now I can go here and click here and then it would switch it as we look at it. Super cool. Now we are moving forward to something called directives. Let's talk about what directives are. Angular directives make it easier for you to add additional behavior to any of the elements. It could be components, it could be some normal HTML elements like divs, span, list items, anchors. Directives are super powerful. Some of the examples of the types of directives are components. So each component is in fact a directive. We also have attribute directives, which just change some things about the existing HTML elements, like adding a class, adding some attribute to it, maybe binding some click events, etc. And then we have some structural directives as well, which either remove or add things to the DOM based on some conditions, for example. And I'm going to show you some built-in directives as well. So we are going to create some directive or a directive called highlight complete to do, just like this. And this is going to be inside the directives folder. So I'm going to copy this and I'm going to open this and clear and then just create the directive just like this. And now that I have this created, I'm just going to close this. One thing that I want to really show you is what a directive or structural directive that can add or remove item from the DOM looks like. For example, I can say conditionally, if I am loading the data from the API, show some loading text, for example. So here I could have a p tag that could say something like loading, but I only want to show this when the data is being loading. So if I look at the template now, you can see the loading is here all the time. I can use a built-in directives from Angular, which is called ngIf, and I have to import that in the imports array. So I can say ngIf right here, and this comes from Angular common, as you can see. Now that I have this, I can go here and say if or ngIf if I don't have to do items dot length, which means that if there is no items or the list is empty, then show loading. Now this is a really bad way of saying that this is loading. I should probably have a loading variable or a signal that is true when the API call is being done and then becomes false when we have the data or when we have some error. But I'm just keeping this simple for now. Now if I go here, you'll see that we saw loading for a brief moment and then we essentially got the data later on. So I'm going to show you what happens right now. So if I just hit play, you can see we have loading, but as soon as the to-dos is set, then the loading goes away, right? So this is a structural directive. Now, what does a structural directive mean? If I go down here and try to find the to-dos element, the app to-dos, you're going to see that inside the app to-dos right now, the loading element doesn't even exist. We just see the UL. If I refresh now, let's see what happens. In the elements tab right now, I can actually see this element. So in the app to dos, this is right here. You can see the loading element and you also see this thing like ngReflect, ngIf. So since this is true, this element is in the DOM, but when this becomes false, the whole element is removed from the DOM. It doesn't exist. So it's not like we are showing or hiding it and the element is still there, but we are just changing the display none or display block. The element doesn't even exist. It just gets removed from the UI. So if I hit play, you're going to see that the element went away and now the UL is rendering a bunch of list items. Now we have a different way of doing this as well, but this used to be the way to do this in the past. Now we can just do this by simply using the @if command, and I can just do the same thing right here. So I'm just going to paste this. And here I can say if we have to do items dot length, but not really. If I say not, then it will do the same thing. And that means you can see the loading right now. If I hit play, it goes away. It's the same thing. And since I'm using the built-in control flow with this @if, I don't even need the ngIf anymore. And that is because this is a recent change that came in Angular. So you can just use @if, for, we have more sort of control flow blocks as well. These are called control flow blocks. Now enough about built-in directives. What about the one that we created? So if I go to directives and the file, this is called app highlight completed to do. What we just want to do is if a to do is done, we just want to be able to show this differently or have sort of a different layout or styling. So what we are going to do is we are going to say this directive will receive if the to-do is completed or not. So what it basically needs is an input. So is completed is going to be a signal, or instead of a signal, we are going to call this input. So this is going to come from outside and this is going to be of type Boolean. So here we can say something like false, by default, and this is going to come from outside. Now that we have the signal created, we want to do something whenever this signal changes. So what we can do here is to use something called an effect, and this effect comes from Angular core as well. So here I'm going to say effect to just import this, and then this effect essentially can be something like this. So you can say something like styles effect equals, and now what I want to do here is to run this particular code. If the completed is true, then I want to change the style of the element. Now we also want to get the element as well. So what we can do here is we can say element equals inject element ref. Now this is element ref is also an Angular service, which essentially gives us the elements ref, or the element on which we have applied this directive. We are going to apply it in just a bit. Now that we have this, we can quickly go and import that into the to-do item. So we can go inside here in the components, and we have the to-do item right here. And I just realized we are not really using the to-do item component so far. So first of all, we need to quickly go and inside our to-dos component, which is the page itself, we need to go into the HTML, and instead of this list item, we can quickly use the to-do item component. So I'm going to cut this, I'm going to go here, and I'm going to paste this just like this. Now, since the to-do item component does not know what a to-do is, we are going to make this accepted from the parent, just like we did with the greeting. So I'm going to go to to-do item components TypeScript file, and in here I can say to-do equals, and I'm going to say input. This is going to be an input signal, and this is going to be of type to-do. And I always want this. That's why I'm going to use input.required. So it's going to be available all the time. Now that we have this, instead of todo.id, we can say to-do and with parentheses. So we always get the to-do just like this. And then the same goes for this. So we have to-do.title, we have to-do.completed, just like this. And we also don't want this ending list item. Now that we have this, let's save this. Let's save the TypeScript file from here as well. And in the to-dos component, now I should be able to use the to-do item. But as you know, in order for me to use the to-do item component in the to-dos one, I need to import this. So I can say to-do item component from here, and then I can go to the HTML. And in here, now I am able to do something like app to-do item, and this requires an input. So here you can see to-do. Where's the to-do? Pass it. So I can pass it using the square brackets, and here I can say to-do equals to-do. That's pretty much it. So now if I look at this, you can see the app works. Everything seems normal. So now that we have done this, I want to go to the to-do item component, and I'm going to close everything else. I want to apply the highlight directive right here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the directives, copy this, and copy this whole selector. And then I'm going to go to to-do item, and on this li, I'm going to paste this right here, just like this. Now I also want to import this, so I can use this. So I can say highlight completed to-do directive. So whether you are about to use a component or a directive, you need to import that in the imports array of the component where you want to use it. So now that I have this applied, let's see what happens. So if I go here, mark this done, nothing really changes because I'm not passing the completed or is completed. So in here, I'm also going to say something like is completed, and here I can say to-do dot completed. Let's save this. Now things will get a bit interesting. You can see that whichever is completed automatically is highlighted, right? But why are their checkboxes not marked as done? That's because the completed value here is set to the value right here. Instead of this, you could also say checked. Now if you see this, this is what we actually wanted. But you will notice that if I try to click here, it doesn't really change the style. And that is because we never change the completed variable from the input when we click on it. We can output an event that we have clicked the checkbox to toggle the completed state. So what we'll do here is that we are going to create an output. So here we can say to-do toggled, and here we're going to say output, and this output would essentially emit a to-do item, right? So what would happen is whenever we click, we can create a function for this, to-do clicked, and this will say this dot to-do toggled dot emit this dot to-do, just like this, which means that whenever we click this particular label or this input is changed, we essentially can go here and then emit the to-do that it was toggled. Now, for this, what we need to do is we just want to say change, and here we can say this dot to do clicked. Simple. Whenever the inputs value change, we emit this toggle. Now, since we emit this from here, we can receive this on the parent side. So we can go to the to-dos component, and here we can say whenever an app to do item is changed, or to-do toggled, as you see here, I want to update the to-do in my to-do items array. So the way we are dealing this is that if anything changes in the to-do item, it has to notify the parent component to-dos, and the to-dos will update the array. When it updates the array, the to-do items which are being rendered automatically update in that particular case. So we're gonna do the same thing here. So we are going to create a function here, and here we are going to say something like to-do toggled, for example, and this is supposed to receive a to-do item. So to-do item, which is supposed to be of type to-do, and then we need to do something about that. But this to-do toggled is what is supposed to be called when this function is triggered. Now the event name and here they both are the same. So I'm going to change this a bit. So here we can say something like update to-do item, for example. So whenever a to-do is toggled from the to-do item, we need to say update to-do item, and we need to pass it as an event. Now, if you mouse over this, you can already see that this has the type to do, which means that here I'm going to get to do item, which means now I can actually work with the to do and update it. So I'm going to quickly code what I want to do here. I'm going to say this dot to do items dot update. So I can get the current to dos. And what I want to return from here is essentially the whole array, but the to do item updated. So I can say to dos dot map. And here I'm going to get the current to do. And I'm going to say return to do by default. But above that, if the to do.id is the same as the to do item to update.id, then I just want to flip the completed switch. So here I can say return this to do, whatever that has, but flip the completed. So here we can say completed, and here we can say not to do dot completed, just switch it. Now I'm going to save this, save the HTML as well. And now let's try it. So if I click this, you can see that now it works as it should. So a lot of coding without any debugging, but things work out. Now I want to show you what happens really when we try to work with our directive. So here we say highlight directive, and you're gonna see that when I click this particular element, Fugiat, Veniam, Minos, whatever that is, this particular effect triggers because the is completed is changed. So now it's going to try to see if it's completed or not. Right now it's not, right? But when I click it, this gets flipped. So this should go inside here. And now you can see that it's applying the text decoration. So it says, try to change the background color as well, and the style color and whatever that is. And then you can see that it automatically updates the UI. That's what we wanted. Now the last topic of this video finally is Angular pipes. Angular pipes is something that you can use to transform the data right in your templates. So not even in the TypeScript files, you can directly apply this in the templates. There are some Angular built-in pipes that I want to show you. For example, we have title case pipe, we have async pipe, currency, date. There's so many pipes that you can use out of the box from Angular. For example, if I just wanted to make all of these title case or uppercase, I could use one of the pipes. I could go inside my to-do item. So for each item, I can apply, let's say, an uppercase pipe. So here I can say uppercase pipe from Angular common. And now that I have this, I can go to my template and I can use that where I'm showing the title. So here I'm showing the title. So here I can say something like pipe, and here I can say uppercase, just like this. And if I save this and save the TypeScript file, you can see that all of my elements right now are transferred to uppercase. Now this is not directly, if you go to the inspect element, you can see that here we don't have a CSS being applied that changes this to uppercase. This is essentially the pipe, which is JavaScript or Angular's built-in pipe, which has JavaScript that changes the text using the pipe. Now the pipes can be really, really beneficial. For example, if you want to show some sort of currency, you want to change the date format, time format, and all of those things, you can essentially use the built-in pipes yourself. But you can also create your custom pipes as well. So we are going to create our custom pipe to filter the to-dos based on some input. So we're going to go to our terminal, and here we are going to just run this ng generate pipe. And we are going to create that inside the pipes folder. So when we do this, this is going to create a filter to do pipe. And we're going to use that to filter the to-dos based on some input. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to close all of this. I'm going to close this as well. And now what I want to do is if I go to to-dos template, instead of rendering all the to-dos, I just want to show the to-dos based on the input that I have. If I am filtering it, for example, here I could go and say, for example, label filter to-dos, and I'm going to create an input right after. So here we have input. Here we can say placeholder search to-dos, for example. And now what I want to do is whenever the input changes, filtering the to-dos that I'm showing based on the input. So for that, first we need to bind the value of this input with some variable. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly go here and I'm going to say something like search term is a signal, and this is going to be empty by default, just like this. And then I need to use forms module to be able to work with the input. So I'm going to go here and import forms module, and then I can go in my HTML and say something like ng model, and here I can now say search term, just like this. And this has to have a name as well. So I'm going to wrap all of that in a form, and then I can give this a name as well, and I can say search term, for example. Now, if I open my application, go to console, there are no errors. So I can filter the to-dos based on this input. But now I also have to use the pipe somehow to use this input as well. So let's go to our pipe. I'm going to go to the pipes folder, and inside we have filter to do pipes. Now let's have a look at this whole pipe. The first thing that you'll notice is that we have the decorator named pipe. Then it tells what is the name of the pipe. So just like we used uppercase, we're going to use filter to do's. Then it has a class which implements pipe transform and has a transform function. All you need to know is that this is the function that you need to use to make the pipe work. Now, this pipe is supposed to take the entire array. Then it also needs to take the inputs value and then return only the items which have the title having the search term. That is the whole idea. If I type D, then it should return every to do which has D in the title, so to say. So the value here is not going to be unknown. This is going to be of type to do array. So I can say something like this. Then we have the arguments. In this sort of arguments, we can say that the second argument that we are going to get inside of args is going to be the search term. So search term is going to be string. And then what we need to return is an array of to-dos. So to do array, easy peasy. By default, we're going to just run the value, or inside of value, we can say to-dos. So here we want to return to-dos, and we want to say if we don't have a search term. So if there's no search term, then just return all the to-dos as it is. If we have a search term, then we need to filter. So we're going to change some code right here. So here we're going to say first take out the search term and make it lowercase. So here we can say text equals search term dot to lowercase. Then we are also going to say return to-dos dot, and now we can use filter. So here we can say filter. We have a single to-do item, and we are going to say if the to-do dot title dot to lowercase dot contains or includes is the right one our search term or the text, then we return true. And now that I see myself, this is not how you should do it. You could just say return here and then remove all of the things from here. So we are only going to return any to-do that has the text in their title. Easy peasy. Now I'm going to save this. And now we are going to use the filter to-dos. So first of all, if I go to my to-dos component HTML, here is where I need to use the pipe. But I want to first import my pipe here. So I can say filter to-dos pipe, just like this. And then in the HTML, I can go here and use the pipe here. So pipe, filter, to-dos. If I just use this, you're going to notice that it expects two arguments. One is the array, which it automatically gets when you use this pipe. But the second one is the search term. So I am going to say colon and then the search term, just like this. And this is a signal, so we provide it like this. Now, if I save this, go here, you can see I still get all of my to-dos right here, right? But what if I try to type delictus? So if I say delictus, you can see all of them actually have delictus in them. Super nice. Now, if we look at sources, we can go to pipe.ts, or it was filter to do's pipe. And we can also look at the transform here. So if I remove everything, there's no search term. It returns to do's, complete array of 200 items. Everything gets rendered. Super nice. But if I type again or whatever that was, now it comes here, makes it to lowercase. And then it also goes inside each particular item, tries to see what is their title, and then if it matches, then it basically adds that and returns it in the to-do. For example, if I search this guy right here, and you can see now it's coming based on that one. And if I type something gibberish, obviously this will not return anything because none of the to-dos have this in the title. And with that said, we are actually done. Right now we have an application which has a home page that has a counter component implemented. We also have a greeting message coming from the parent component. And then we have a list of to-dos, which actually uses a real HTTP call to an external API, gets the to-dos, renders them, and we can also mark them as done or not. We are using a directive, we are using a pipe for filtering, and we are using the components to build up this whole logic as well. So you know a lot about Angular than you knew before. And now I want to actually thank you for following up this video so far. I know that learning a new technology can be really, really difficult, but you need to be consistent. You need to take your time and don't worry about the end result. Just be consistent and be authentic with the efforts you're trying to do. I'm going to plug this thing again. If you want to really, really get good at Angular, you need to get this book. This contains a lot of topics, including animations, progressive web apps, and what I taught you is probably the tip of the iceberg with what you can do with Angular. And you saw me how I can code really fast with Angular and create applications with the experience that I've gotten over the years, and all of that experience is in this book. With that said, I want to know your perspective on the video. What did you like? What did you not like completely at all? Let me know in the comments, and if you're looking for more Angular videos, probably start with this one. As always, happy coding. I'm gonna see you in the next one.